Hey everybody, this is Zach from Team DUEL. I'm the manager and coach and former professional player in the PUBG scene with Team Onslaught. And today I'd like to bring you some of my opinions on circle progression and some tips and tricks that you can think about when making decisions along the line of the progression throughout the game, and basically allowing yourself to prioritize things that are more important from a competitive PUBG perspective. So I first like to lay out the kind of the basis for this conversation is breaking the game out into three kind of crucial parts. So the first one being the early game. And that is classified basically as the looting phase, wherever you're initially going to be dropping, and that kind of portion. This usually lasts nothing longer than the first circle, and even in most cases it can only be 2 minutes or something like that. The second portion of this is actually the mid game, and the mid game is kind of classified as after the first circle all the way kind of transitioning to third circle, kind of depending upon what region of the map it's actually going to be located at. And then the final or the late game is after that third circle progression, where it really starts to shrink and diminish that player count down. And all three different points of the game during these three phases, the early, mid, and late game, really need to be treated differently in terms of your overall priorities as a team that you need to be able to take into account and make decisions on. So it's really important to kind of shift those based upon when it is in the game. So early game, for example, we're going to go ahead and take a look at Pachinki as a whole. It's a very well-known spot. There's a lot of different buildings and a lot you can actually be doing here on the actual map. So with early game, there are three kind of main important things. The first one being car locations and securing a car. The second being not dying as a whole. And then the third being loot. So the reason why I put it in priority order for this particular case is actually because going into the mid game, cars are more important than potentially having like three people. Even losing a member or having less loot, cars are more important. It's going to make it so you can transition earlier into different locations, basically allowing you to open up your early options and not really funnel yourself to staying on edge and then moving around other teams. You're going to be in the middle and you're going to have less distance to travel. So that's why cars are kind of the number one priority in the early game section. The second kind of priority, I would say, for taking into account for this early game, like I said, was the actual staying alive. So early game fights are really bad for your team overall. There are certain circumstances, like in Pachinki, where you kind of want to force a team out of the town or restrict their loot, that basically come into account that can be beneficial, and there can be some infighting involved just to kind of get a team out of your hair. But overall, early game fights are kind of bad. Losing a member early on is kind of crucial, and even loot is less important. Like, you can have 4 people with less amount of loot and be able to crash a compound later on, and then take that chance to fight another team and eventually get kills on them and take that approach, as opposed to losing one early and then getting full looted. Just because having that extra body going into a lot of situations is going to be a lot better. And the third is actual loot. So getting your scopes, getting your meds, your ammunition, and getting that all ready to go. So those are the priority order from early game kind of progression. And this typically lasts even in a lot of cases before the first circle fully closes. So most teams in competitive setting are moving very early on, trying to get that center position, those good compounds, and more importantly, being able to put yourself in a good point going into the mid game. So that's really the early game, is really setting yourself up for the mid game to succeed, which is arguably one of the most important parts. And going into the mid game, you have certain situations where you might be here in Pachinki and your team dropped there. You might have 1 or 2 vehicles. And if you have a really good early game, something that would look like, say, you have a center circle around over here in the north of shelter area around the blue box and Alamo, would be looking to go ahead and leave earlier and taking that positional kind of thing, the overall good position, and keeping your car going into the mid game, because the priority order for going into the mid game is actually overall position, as well as keeping your car alive, and then basically taking some smart engagements. At this point, you're kind of wanting to still avoid conflict. It's better for you. If someone crashes you, you're definitely going to be fighting them, because this is going to be where you're jockeying for different positions. You're going to be fighting other teams. But really, it's about smart engagements, choosing your fights very, very carefully in this particular case. If you get kills and think about it, in some scenarios it might not be good for loot. Let's say early on your team rotated from Pachinki to Alamo here, and you had someone driving and rotating up this way over towards Plateau and Mansion. You got some kills over here from just downs and vehicles. In some cases, it could be safe to go ahead and loot that, but in other cases, it might not be smart to do that if there's someone over here, and depending upon your car situation. So really making those smart engagements specifically for how you're going to loot, but also taking into account the overall positioning and keeping your cars safe. That's kind of the priorities of mid-game. This typically lasts after the circle pop for the next 2 or 3 circles, where you can be hopping around to different areas, keeping track of how different teams are actually moving and where they are overall. So we can think of a scenario where, as I was mentioning, where team was in Alamo over here, and you saw one team go in Plateau, you had one team in Mansion, you heard shots towards Prison, so there's probably 2 teams there, and let's say a scenario where the circle pops east. It definitely might not be in your best favor to, knowing all the information coming from Alamo, transition to a high priority compound up here right away, because the other teams in Mansion or in the priority compound here outside of Prison are actually going to be there to beat you. So thinking about those different things of where everybody is in relation to circle, and figuring out how to transition better in that particular case and move around. So taking all of those things into account, really keeping overall good positioning in car, and then maintaining some sort of loot as well as bodies up going into the late game. So the late game is where it gets really, really interesting. This is kind of where you flip the switch. And by flipping the switch, I mean turning on a form of aggression. You're going to find yourself in a lot more situations that are probably less favorable, because there's going to be a larger capacity of players in a smaller area. So there's just going to be more density of people in a smaller zone. So you can have a zone that's ending up here on the hill west of Lipovka, and having something like 2 different teams in this area, 1 team on this shack, 3 different teams in Lipovka, 1 in this priority compound, and 1 in yellow. And that's just a small portion of the map, where it can be a small radius right here, as you can see, where you're really going to have to be careful and choosing your fights wisely, because that's one of the priorities of late game is really just getting in the position to get in the circle. But the way you do that is actually through wrapping and preventing pinches. So pinches, when very simple concept of when you have 1 team on one side and 1 team on another, and they both start fighting you at the same exact time. So the way to prevent that is with basically calculated aggression, and basically going forward and choosing one of the fights and saying, we're here at the shack. We have 4 players up because we played early and mid game really, really well. We've lost some of our cars because this priority compound has gone ahead and shot us. But we have a small distance to run here. And we know there's some teams that are going to be coming back this way. But we also know there's a team very, very close on some rocks in this location. So one of the things and decisions you can make in that situation with your team being here is taking the early situation of, rather than taking a fight later on and having more teams collapsing on you, is taking this early fight and clearing this actual team with that calculated aggression and moving in on them to kind of mitigate that threat. You might lose a person in that situation, but you're going to get 1 placement from killing that actual team. And you're going to prevent one of the potential pinches, because then if they were the only team on that side, then you can deal with people specifically coming in from this side, depending upon where the circle's at. And this is very, very like situational late game. You can be in this compound and it can center on you, and your main priority is just to make sure no one crashes you, keep everybody up, and kind of go about your business that way. So it's a pendant, but that's one of the key concepts of improving late game. And if you find yourself in a situation where you're down or you're in a really bad position, let's say you're at the bottom of these warehouses, you know there's teams up here, and you need to get to the base of the hill on some of these rocks or some defilades over in this area. Really, the third part is getting utility, which is going to be done in early and mid game. So in regards to like loot priority, ammo, meds, and utility, and now post 1.0, smokes are very, very important, as well as frags, in going ahead and allowing yourself to make different moves that aren't really possible without it. So one of the things you can do if you find yourself in a situation of having to go up a hill like this is throwing a smoke barrier to get your team into a position where you're moving in trees. So utilizing those three different things and taking those account into priority for late game. So really, I would say the biggest one is getting into a good position. So figuring out within the next circle where the position you're going to be going, and then preventing those overall those wraps and pinches, as well as wrapping yourself as a team around the edge of the circle. And then go ahead and utilizing that utility when necessary to go ahead and get your team into that position. So incorporating all of those different things, let's go ahead and take a look at what an ideal game would look like for a team dropping Raws. So we have a situation here where we have a full team that's going to drop Raws, and let's say you got contested by another team. Your team decided that we're going to have one here at the top of plateau on Raws, and then you're going to have two drop here, one in the priority building and one next to the priority building. And then let's just say your third guy drops here, and you see that 4 members of the other team drop on this side. So one of the things you do and notice is you have a car in the situation and there's no one in Watertown. So one of the things you can do is, taking into account that first priority of that car, you can either drop in this Watertown or take this car here and just secure that actual location. So that way your team has an out. And then taking into account priority 2, maybe it's not the best situation to go push through here for loot. Maybe the circle goes northwest or southeast or a different location. So keeping in mind trying to stay alive and keep bodies up going to the mid and late game, your team basically utilizes that car and gets out and whatever it be. And then the loot might not be the best, but you can go ahead and, let's say in this situation, the circle goes ahead and pops to the southeast, like Milta side. You go ahead and rotate out this way in one of your cars, and you decide to go to farm and go ahead and utilize loot there and get caught up on that. So that would be the ideal early game. So avoiding that early game fight against the other team that dropped Rozhawk with you, securing a car or two from this location and moving down in this Milta into the farm, which would be around center circle. In that case, the circle popped here. And then going ahead and being there after the first circle pops. So the next 2 or 3 circles, let's say, in this case, it stays on this north side. For the first one, you don't go ahead up moving, and you have the main warehouse kind of position and main warehouse compound here. You're spread out. The first circle is really good for you, and then the second one go ahead and goes north around shelter. Some of the information that you had previously is there is a team over here in this flat top double stack compound, as well as this one, and you heard shots there, and you didn't hear anything to the west, but there was a lot of shots further south, and you got some kills and were able to take some loot. So you go ahead and progress to a different position up north and secure your cars, take 2 of them at this point to the Wizard Tower location, and really just keep get a position that's going to be in, and maybe not the best position because it's centered around shelter, but you're going to be in the zone. And it kind of goes this way for the next 2 or 3 circles. And when it closes in, the center's here around shelter, and you guys are on the edge. So maybe not the best scenario for your team to be in. It would be really good if you were in center, but that's kind of the situation you're dealt with going into the late game. So one of the things in this particular scenario, in kind of we're running through, is we have a team here, still have another team here. We heard 2 or 3 teams fighting shelter, and we know there's a team down the hill. Let's say it pops further north, just north of shelter around this compound or something, and you know these are both occupied. Let's just give that kind of criteria on top of that. So you're in a rough position, and you kind of need to get over here to the shack. Let's just say it in. So with that kind of information, what you're going to do is wrap around the edge of the circle. Go ahead and check if that's shack is already taken. And in this case, the team to the west was already occupying that scenario. So you go ahead and wrap down and choose that fight smartly to go ahead and take this overall position. You fight and you kill them, and now you're going into one of the final 2 circles in this kind of area where you're just on the edge, but you're going. And then let's say after that scenario, there's around 20 some people alive. There's a lot of people. There's 2 or 3 teams in the compound, 1 in the blue box, and then 2 or 3 teams around shelter. Everybody else is kind of moved in and skirted in on the edge of zone, and it pops around you guys. You get really lucky with the actual circle. So you keep your cars up and just watch your side, and then it comes down to a situation where it closes in on this actual road. And you work with your team, you prevent wraps on both sides, and then utilize your utility to cross the road here. So using your smokes, going through that certain situation to get across into a defilade that's really good here, and then end up fighting the last teams coming out of the compound. So that could be one hypothetical situation of how that would actually play out, where maybe not everything played out in your situation in your guys' favor as a team, but you decided to rotate from farm to a safe position, and then utilize wrapping late game, got some kills, got some loot, and you ended up utilizing your utility to cross the road and then fight some other teams coming across. So the early game transition, staying alive, getting minimal loot, but it ended up recompensating by moving to farm and looting some more there, and then securing your car in mid game, keeping it alive so you can make different rotations around this area, and then utilizing your utility late game and wrapping in order to get a good position and kind of win you the game. So with that being said, those are some like simple different things that you can think about with the early and mid game and late game circle progression, and figuring out ways to actually prioritize how your team should be thinking about where they're actually moving, where the loot's more important, how to actually secure your car early game and keep it alive mid game, and basically taking the best position with what you were actually dealt with in that scenario. So giving you that prioritization list. So given any kind of random situation on the map, you're able to understand the different things that your team can do with the utility that they have, and kind of make the best of that situation. So I think with this and actually being able to practice it, so one of the ways to actually practice it is to clearly break apart the early, mid game, and late game as a team, within the team as a whole, and being able to distinguish those priorities and really go down an actual checklist before you move on to the next portion of the game. So saying as a team, do we have a car? Yes, getting that different information, like are we all alive, should be pretty straightforward for that particular scenario, but choosing not to take those early game fights. And then step 3, just getting that actual loot, double checking in with everybody of what they have for zoom, ammo, and those different things early game, and then transitioning that mid game, getting information on different positions, keeping those cars alive, repositioning cars after you crash a compound to make sure that they're good to go, pending wherever the next circle goes. So taking into account of all of that information, and then also taking in all of the information that's around you. Where are the shots coming from? Where do you see teams go? And how is that going to make transitioning going into the next circle? So handling all of those different things, and thinking about those in mid game, and going into the late game, just getting everybody up, and then thinking about late game of which fight do we want to take? Who do we want to kill to make sure that in going into the next circle, if we have to move, we're going to be in a better spot because we got rid of this threat. So reducing those threats and taking those calculated fights, or utilizing calculated aggression against other teams is the best way to look at it. And then hopefully combining all of that will increase your odds going into the game. So this is typically some of the ways that I would take a look at doing this, and just overall circle progression. Hope you guys like this. Hope it's helpful. Hopefully the scenario I gave you was pretty good for that. So go ahead and give me some feedback on this, and I'll produce some more content for you guys. Thanks so much. Lift, bro.